Welcome to Mixing with Mike, and this is a tip on why vintage plugins will not make you a good engineer. Many of the people that I've talked to recently that have gone about the process of buying loads of plugins, they stack up their library with tons of plugins and they spend all kinds of money thinking that because they have some vintage Neve emulation that this is somehow going to make them a great engineer. And the truth of this is that no vintage plugin or even vintage console is going to make you a good engineer. So if you bring in an engineer who with little experience and you put them in front of a Neve console and a perfectly aligned tape machine and all the microphones they could ever want, they're not going to get a great recording if they're not a good engineer, period. So you have to really get down to the fundamentals of engineering, and particularly with mixing, in order for those plugins and processing to be most effective. So for example here, in my workshops, what I really teach is about subtractive EQ and the use of functional compression. And so without the vintage plugins, if I take my vintage plugins away, which are API, and I have a little Neve emulation here at the beginning of my channel strip, this is what it sounds like. So this is just a basic drum sound. Now if I take away all of my functional processing, this is what I get. So I can put in my vintage plugins here, and it sounds better, but it still sounds really boxy. And what happens with a lot of people is that they think, okay, well, I have this vintage emulation of the Neve console, and I have these API compressors, and I have all this stuff, and this is going to make it sound great. And that's not really the case. You still have to know what to do once you get those plugins so that when you apply them, you really get the most out of them. And this is something that can only be taught by actually going through the process and learning what it takes to make something sound big and open. So if I enable my plugins here across here, and what I have is subtractive EQ, a little bit of gating here on the snare bottom, and some functional compression to help recede the drums back in the speakers a bit, we have a nice open drum sound, right? And so even if I take away my Neve console emulation, I still have that. So what that does is it helps to enhance and add warmth to what it is that I'm doing. Same with the API. The API adds the punch, but that punchiness only comes because of the work that I've done prior to it. And if I take away all that prior work, then the effectiveness of the API is less apparent. Right? It takes a sort of okay drum sound and makes it a little bit better than okay. The way that I like to say this is very simple. You can stack up loads of really amazing plugins, but if what you're working with to begin with is a turd, then all you're really doing is polishing a turd. So the idea is that you really have to dig into proper engineering skills so that when you start to use these things, they actually make sense. There are many engineers who made really crappy recordings on Neve consoles with the best equipment, best microphones, and best tape machines. That is not what makes you a great engineer. And the real judge of being a good engineer is, can you still get a great sound if you don't have all that stuff? That shows that you have real engineering skills. And that's what this tip is all about. So before you go out and spend loads of money on your vintage plugins, make sure you learn a little bit more about engineering. So if you feel like your mixes are really good and need that little bit extra edge, then vintage plugins and things like that are a good buy for you, and that's what you should be going for. But if you find that your mixes are just like very average sounding, and you think that vintage plugins is going to take it over the edge, then you better rethink that and start to study your mixing skills and your engineering skills a little bit better. So this is our Mixing with Mike tip on why vintage plugins will not make you a good engineer. And you can join the Mixing with Mike classes that occur every Wednesday night at 7 p.m. And you can go to mpginsider.com, click on the Mixing with Mike ad on there, and sign yourself up and join into the live classes every Wednesday. Thanks.